Oh, hello everyone, and Walt, thanks for that fantastic introduction. Thanks also for the invitation to be here and to join all of you. It's a real honor for me. I've been looking forward to this. And I really want to commend all of you for doing something that is actually one of the good parts of religion. Walt alluded to the fact that I grew up deeply religious in Independence, Missouri. And I don't miss the religious dogma or anything that was ever said from the pulpit, but I do sometimes miss a sense of community and organization that religion has. And I think it's fantastic that as free thinkers, you are kind of recreating some of that. I think it's good for the mind and the soul. It's also good for politics, because if you sometimes wonder why the evangelicals, for example, are such a powerful political force in this country, it's because they're organized. And because that structure of coming together in their congregations with like-minded people, there is a political power in that. So I like to see secularists, humanists, free thinkers of all types coming together in community. And I'm happy to be here to support you a little bit in that. I want to thank the San Francisco Public Library. I think it's important to acknowledge where we are and how great it is to live in a place where they welcome all sorts of civic perspectives and dialogue. Whether that is a drag queen story hour, teaching young people about diversity and our common humanity, no matter what we look like, before those stereotypes and dogmas get too hardwired, or whether it's a group like this with a name that some might find provocative, the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I find that the essence of First Amendment constitutionalism and everything that our Enlightenment era founders wanted this secular nation to be. I find it deeply American, but some would certainly find it provocative. And what better place to meet than a library for people who are critical thinkers, who question dogma, and who want to defend the separation of church and state. I think we also have to acknowledge that in communities all over this country right now, unfortunately, libraries are being told to ban books and to ban entire subject matters. You have some that are being defunded and closed for religious reasons. And this is really nothing new. A place of truth and science and learning, like our public libraries, has always been a threat to narrow-minded authoritarian religionists. Just ask Galileo about that. But I'm grateful that it's different here in San Francisco and here in California and lots of other places. So thanks to the library. Now, before we go any further, I should expand on the generous introduction that Walt gave you. I, of course, am a member of Congress, and I represent a district that begins at the Golden Gate Bridge and goes all the way to Oregon. I have this gorgeous, beautiful North Coast Congressional District, and I am the only non-religious member of Congress. I'm a humanist. I feel like, you know, in addition to representing that beautiful district, because I'm the only one of me in the Congress, I, in some ways, am a surrogate representative for a lot of secularists all over the country. And so I sometimes find myself, you know, speaking to a humanist group in Florida, or next week I'll be talking to some Unitarians in Anchorage, Alaska. And I'm here with you today, even though I had to go over the bridge into Nancy Pelosi's district, which I do once in a while. But I'm happy to do it because I just am a big supporter of civically engaged secularists wherever they may be. And I want to spend most of our time today talking about whatever questions are on your mind. But I thought I'd speak to a few things at the outset that you might find interesting, including how I decided to defy conventional political wisdom and come out as a non-religious humanist in Congress. And then also, after that, how I joined with a few of my colleagues to found the Congressional Freethought Caucus. And then we can talk about whatever you would like. But I was elected to Congress in 2012. And for my first several years, I did what a lot of atheists, agnostics, and humanists do when they are presented with the endless interviews and questionnaires that ask about your religious perspective. I dodged. I was vague. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One, you know, I think I did to some degree accept the conventional wisdom that being a non-believer was bad politics. But the other reason was kind of personal. I had an elderly mother who was deeply religious, and I just didn't want to upset her, quite honestly. But a couple things changed. In 2017, my dear mother died, and so I no longer needed to worry about upsetting her. But almost right after that, I got one of those questionnaires that members of Congress always get. And I can't remember if it was from the Freedom from Religion Foundation C4 or if it was from the American Humanist Association. But whatever the case, in that moment, I was ready to be very candid. And I filled out that questionnaire in a way that I think surprised the group when they got it back, and my phone rang. And they wanted to, did you really mean what you said in these various answers to our questionnaire? And I believe it was Roy Speckart from the American Humanist Association who reached out to me at that time. And I said, yeah, in fact, I do. And he asked me if I was a humanist, and I frankly have always suspected I was a humanist. I've been reading Vonnegut and all sorts of other works by humanists, and everything I knew about it just seemed to align. But Roy sent me a book that he had written about humanism, and after I read it, I called him up and said, I pretty much check every box. I think you got me pegged, I'm a humanist. And so he then asked if I might consider going public with that and, breaking a barrier of sorts. And I said that I would, but not before giving it a lot of careful thought. And so I went about some vetting. I certainly talked to the closest people to me in my family, my closest friends and advisors. Every one of them said, don't do it. There was not a single one who said, what a great idea. Yeah, all of them told me not to do it. But then I also found, surprising support from two people whose advice I sought, and I expected them to tell me not to do it, but they didn't. One was Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a devout Catholic, person of deep faith, and I wanted to make sure to vet this with her before going public because in that moment, back in 2017, Democrats were really being encouraged to do a better job of connecting with the faith community. There was a feeling that Republicans had sort of cornered the market on faith. And many of my Democratic colleagues were really urging Democrats to get more religious in our politics. So this went against every political grain in that moment, and yet Nancy Pelosi, to her great credit, said, I think humanism is beautiful. Why wouldn't you do it? And then I talked to the House chaplain, a Jesuit priest by the name of Father Pat Conroy. I surely expected him to tell me this was a bad idea and maybe pray for me or something else. But in fact, he said he wished that we had more members of Congress who were just authentic in their views, and that he too thought it was a great thing. So I kind of went with my gut, but I was affirmed at least by those two supportive voices. And I decided to do this, and then we went about deciding how to do it. And the first offer that we had was from USA Today to sort of expose me as the non-believer in Congress. I thought that was a pretty bad idea, and certainly not the way I wanted to roll this thing out. So I talked to a friend who was a journalist at the Washington Post, and he told me about the religion writer that he knew and worked with, and I kind of interviewed her to some extent before letting her interview me, and came to feel really comfortable that she was going to do a nice, thoughtful piece. And I think that has made a big difference in why that political backlash that some warned me about never came. It has been great, literally without exception. And I think part of it is that opening article where she sort of introduced me to the country as a non-believer was really thoughtful. I was not antagonistic of religion. I was very respectful of it. And I also identified myself as spiritually curious and interested. I think the quote that she gave was, if there's a God and he ever wants to talk to me, I'll take the call. So people were pretty good with it. And the politics was just fine. And that led me to the next step in my journey, which is joining up with a couple of my congressional colleagues to create the Freethought Caucus. And it kind of started with Jamie Raskin and me discussing this. He's a great friend and very much of a fellow traveler with all of us, but also a colleague who just left the Congress but is a big-time mathematician and scientist, Jerry McNerney. And really the three of us got it rolling, and then we added several other members, and as Walt said, we are now up to about 16 or 17 in this Congress. So that has been wonderful, and several of our members of that caucus are not in deep, safe blue districts like me. Several of them are what we call frontliners in some of the most targeted, contentious congressional districts in America, and they survived just fine. This Freethought Caucus was not used against them. So I think there's a number of data points here that being a free thinker, you know, it's a continuum of free thought. I'm the only one that's really out there. But being somewhere on that continuum of free thought is not the political death sentence that it once was and that many people continue to think it might be. So you know a bit about the Freethought Caucus. The group is basically organized around a few central pillars. First is to promote public policy based on science and reason. We're always happy to co-sponsor the Darwin Day resolution every year in the Congress. We promote the separation of church and state to protect the secular character of our government. I know you all care a lot about that. And we champion freedom of thought and freedom from discrimination against any individuals based on either their faith or their lack of faith. And then finally, we hope that this group provides a forum for members of Congress to actually discuss their moral frameworks, their ethical values, and their personal religious journeys. We talk a lot about, you know, going over to Jamie Raskin's house and just over drinks, you know, kind of sharing our religious journeys, because it's pretty interesting. I have Hank Johnson from Georgia, who's a Buddhist. We have a Hindu. We have a bunch of people who are militant atheists, but they won't tell you that. So it's really, and some people of faith as well. Some cultural Jews who are non-believers in every sense, but cultural Judaism is a strong identity and a strong thing, as many of you know. So it's a really interesting group of people, and I hope, you know, one of these days we can share our stories with each other. That probably will not be a public conversation, but one of the things I hope to do with the Freethought Caucus. So, look, I think our work has never been more important, and you all, I'm sure, have a sense for this with this radical Supreme Court, with the violent white nationalist MAGA crowd and this theocracy dystopia that they're trying to turn our country into. We really need champions of secularism, and our Freethought Caucus, I think, has really grown into the place where that work is done in the Congress. And we work really closely with the Freedom from Religion Foundation and other secular groups. So very grateful for that. And I think at this point I will stop and be glad to speak to whatever questions you might have of me. Let's start in the front.
Okay. So your transition from your religious perspective to your current humanist perspective, was there a identifiable break, or was it an evolution?
Well, my break from religion was definitely identifiable.
Okay.
That happened in my early 20s. Walt sort of alluded to the fact that I went from, you know, religious kid from Independence, Missouri to the beaches of Santa Barbara, and I was a volleyball star and, you know, getting a liberal education, and religion was just not going to last long for me. But there were also some personal events in my life where religion just didn't speak to me anymore, just didn't answer the questions that I had. So it's never easy, you know, to go from being a deeply religious person to being in spiritual drift, really. And I'm sure like many of you, I spent a good part of my youth just really trying to figure it all out, figure out who I am and what I thought of all these things. It's something that, you know, we can talk about over a drink sometime. But that definitely got all ironed out in my 20s, and then it was just a matter of a formality, really, of just accepting the label of humanism, because that's what I was. Yeah?
My You spoke about libraries and how they're banning books, and I was just wondering, is there a legal basis for doing this? What are they using to justify such things?
I don't. If there is a legal basis, I don't think it's a very good one, and I think it strains the Constitution. But these are public facilities, public programs, taxpayer funded, and so there's no requirement that any state or community actually provide public libraries. I think the state of Missouri actually has legislated the closure, or it's been proposed that they legislate the closure of public libraries. They are so threatened by these places of learning. And that's just tragic, and it's 100% about a religious agenda. So that's where I could imagine a constitutional or legal argument against it if they're dumb enough to put that into the public record, that's why they're doing it. But it, I think, will be an uphill fight to protect libraries against this in many cases, because there's a lot of discretion in how public dollars are spent. Mm-hmm.
There are a number of members of Congress that are Baptists. Traditionally, Baptists have had a very strong view on the separation of church and state, less so in recent years. I'm wondering if you think that there's a likely movement in this direction, or there are circumstances by which the Baptist members of the House and the Senate might be moved toward more forthright declarations about the separation of church and state at this time. And secondly, you've referred to a number of members of the Congress that are humanists or are atheists but are not forthright about it. I wonder if you imagine circumstances under which these closet secularists might come out.
Yeah, so starting with the second part of your question, it'll be up to them to decide. But I think every time one of our frontliners in the Freethought Caucus survives a tough race, every time they see me seemingly doing just fine, I get reelected with better numbers each cycle, it seems, knock on wood. But my constituents are very comfortable with who I am, what I am. So I think more members will begin to figure that out. But that risk tolerance in politics is a pretty personal call for all of them. You referred to Baptists, and I do agree that there's a potential interfaith alliance, a really powerful interfaith alliance that we have on defending the separation of church and state. We should embrace that and build it. And there's a Baptist group, I believe her name is Amanda Tyler, and I can't remember the exact title of the Baptist organization she's part of, but she's a real champion on these things and has worked closely with a lot of secularist scholars and experts on, for example, really telling the story of how Christian nationalism was at the core of the January 6th insurrection. They've done fantastic work together.
Is there a Baptist caucus in the House?
I don't know. I don't know if there's a Baptist caucus, but there's plenty of Bible study, evangelical caucusing and organizing in Congress. It's everywhere. Just come to Washington sometime during the week of the Congressional Prayer Breakfast, and it'll curl your hair. Yeah, in the back.
Just to preface this, we are part of the Burton Pelosi Caucus of San Francisco, so we welcome you to visit here, what you said about Nancy. But my question just pops into my head. Do you have any particular relationship or opinion about your state of Jefferson constituency up in the northern part of the district? Or do you think they're going to be part of the 51st state anyhow?
Well, I do. If you know my district and the northern part of it, there is a movement that's been around for decades now to succeed from California, and on the Oregon side to succeed from the state of Oregon and try to form what would be, I think, the poorest state in the United States if they succeeded. It makes no sense, but it is just part of this grievance, part of this mistrust of government both state and federal. They'd probably like to succeed from the United States if they could, as does Texas. So no, it's not a serious thing. It's a small percentage of the population up there who even feels that way. But unfortunately, they sometimes get sheriffs on their side. These rural so-called constitutional sheriffs have grandiose notions of their authorities and their place in the political system. It is not a serious scholarly legal position, but many of them believe that they are the ultimate interpreters of the Constitution. So, yeah, I guess we've got a terrible radical Supreme Court, or we could just let the sheriffs interpret the Constitution. Either way, it's not going well, and no, I don't think there will ever be a state of Jefferson. Yeah. Yes, Walt?
We have a couple of committee members who couldn't be here, so they've given me a couple of questions to ask. Why is separation of church and state such a controversial topic in the U.S. rather than a respected component of a healthy democracy?
Mm-hmm. I think because a certain percentage of Americans, and it's a declining demographic, I believe, but they've never accepted that this is a secular, non-Christian nation. They have clung to the idea that we are somehow a Christian nation, and they will selectively cite things that some founders said about religion that they believe supports their view, that we are meant to be pretty much not even Judeo-Christian, really just pretty Christian in our foundings. And I've now got some colleagues who are just really militant about it, and these are not serious people, but the Marjorie Taylor Greens and Lauren Boeberts of the world, who are going into churches and pandering by saying there's never been a separation of church and state, and contorting First Amendment religious liberty, and even openly embracing Christian nationalism, which is really unfortunate. But that's just a thread of our politics, and as bad as it is right now, if you've listened to Rachel Maddow's podcast. I forget the name of it, but some of you must know the name of that podcast. Haven't seen it's going to come to me. But in any event, it talks about 100 years ago when we went through an earlier version of this America First Christian nationalism. Father Coughlin, some really corrupted U.S. senators, who were in league with the Nazis and basically espousing this deep anti-Semitic Christian nationalist agenda that included violence and attacks on our government 100 plus years ago, almost kept us out of World War II. But we've been there before, and I think this has just been a recurring thread in our politics, but never the dominant one and never a successful one, thankfully. Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with the, I'm sorry. Are you?
Hello?
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Heather Cox Richardson, the
Yeah.
historian?
Mm-hmm.
She's done quite a bit of work on exposing the role of Christian nationalism, which is becoming more and more visible in news reports now. People are talking about it more.
So you're familiar with her?
I am, and you're right. I feel our Freethought Caucus contributed to, I think, the fact that this time around people are beginning to understand, and the media is beginning to understand, Christian nationalism, which if you just look at that phrase, might seem benign, is really dark and insidious and violent and un-American. And it's gratifying to see more and more people kind of calling that out and understanding it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious how viable you think it might be, whether legally or politically, for California to have a state tax on religious organizations.
A state-based tax, independent of the IRS.
Of any federal tax.
Well, it's fun to think about. the IRS has just been beaten down into a terrible, ineffective institution when it comes to even just applying the law to religious entities. It's really disgraceful, and they are granting tax-deductible church status to these very political right-wing organizations that are clearly not churches. If some of you are following this, they've just been so beaten down by Republicans in Congress that they've become a rubber stamp for anyone who wants to say they're a church and avoid any kind of public scrutiny or taxation. And that's a shame. This kind of goes back to the Lois Lerner episode and other things. But there is a real problem in this space. I mean, there was a piece, I saw it at least a few days ago, I think it was the Texas Tribune and ProPublica did an analysis of 20 specific cases that they can document where preachers from the pulpit endorsed political candidates in partisan races. Overtly, just come on up here in front of my congregation, I am endorsing you, I'm telling everyone to get out and vote. Just rampant violation of the Johnson Amendment, and nothing is done about it. So at some point we've got to push back against this encroachment of rank partisan politics into religion. They can. My view is they can do any of that they want to do. They just can't do it and claim tax-exempt status. Someone in California should try, and maybe that would be a wake-up call to the IRS. Yeah.
Do you have an opinion on expanding the Supreme Court? I'm sorry.
Do you have an opinion about expanding the Supreme Court?
So my opinion on expanding the Supreme Court is I really don't like to peddle false hope to friends. And I know there are a lot of folks who, are would so love to hear, some easy thing we could do to change this terrible radical Supreme Court and all of this dark money agenda and other things that we're battling against. But I think if we were to change either the Supreme Court or the appellate court structure, it really should be done, in a scholarly sort of good of the institution basis and not as a reaction to the politics of a court that we don't like. Because if we go that route, it's just going to come back the other direction at some point down the road. It won't be durable and will be, frankly, just unlikely to happen. So I'm kind of open to the fact that, if someone wants to make the argument that we need more justices on the Supreme Court for institutional reasons and policy reasons, I'm very open to that. But if it's just to try to outflank a conservative majority on the Supreme Court, I just am not sure that's a productive thing to pursue. Yeah.
What about limiting the amount of time somebody can serve on the court?
Now that makes a lot of institutional and common sense. A code of ethics for the Supreme Court seems rather timely in light of yesterday's bombshell. Again, thank you, ProPublica. I think there's some things that we can do. But when it comes to just changing the kind of Supreme Court we have, I think we're going to have to do the hard work of electing senators and presidents who put good people on the bench. And maybe we can impeach Clarence Thomas on the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess this thing about Thomas accepting gifts originally was published in the Los Angeles Times, I believe, and it was probably 15 or more years ago. How come it's taken this long before somebody finally brought this to everybody's attention?
I don't know. I was unaware of that prior expose, but...
Apparently that's when he stopped reporting right after that. He was reporting these things, but as soon as they exposed it, he stopped reporting. So I think he's...
And it was the same crazy yacht trips and jet setting around the world. Well, shame on everyone then for not focusing on that then. Yeah.
except that he's saying that he was advised that he didn't have to report it. Who knows what the laws are? As you say, a code of ethics.
Code of ethics, yeah. And there is a bill, I think it's by Hank Johnson and Jamie Raskin, that's been introduced to legislate that requirement. So we should support that.
Well, I've got this. You've mentioned two things that pique my curiosity. One is the idea of a congressional chaplain,
Mm-hmm.
when clearly not all of Congress is Catholic or even Christian.
Yeah.
And now I've forgotten what the other one was. Joys of growing old.
Congressional prayer breakfast, maybe? Was it?
No, but that's up there with that.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing was the number of Catholics on the Supreme Court, so that's back
Oh,
to
right.
the Supreme Court.
Oh, absolutely. And these are not Pope Francis Catholics. These are like Opus Dei Catholics. And so, yeah, so in terms of the House and Senate chaplains, because there's one in each branch of Congress, yeah, I think it's pretty hard to justify having them. But it's even harder to justify the fact that they won't allow a humanist guest chaplain to offer the opening prayer of sessions of Congress. Pretty much the only thing these chaplains do is they give an opening prayer every day. And, if those prayers were secular and, intended to meet the spiritual needs of all members regardless of their religions, it would be one thing, but they're not. They're very dogmatic. And in fact, we allow these chaplains to basically use that moment at the pulpit to editorialize about our politics. And when the Senate chaplain says something that's like pro-civil rights and that I agree with, I see many of my colleagues saying, way to go, Senate chaplain. But if a Senate chaplain or a House chaplain said something disparaging of abortion rights, for example, I think we would have a different view. And neither side should be, rooting for the chaplain who validates their politics in the name of God. That's just, I think, indefensible in a secular government. But we've been doing it for a long time. And the Supreme Court has upheld the ability of each house as a matter of its authority to sort of administer its own rules and procedures to have chaplains. And also, the Supreme Court has not agreed with us that, we need to allow non-theistic and humanist invocations on an equal basis. So we just haven't had any success in challenging these practices in that institution. Yeah, in the back. Walt, you want
to? Two last questions.
Okay.
There's been a lot of problems about abortion these days, and the solution has always been for Congress to pass some laws about it. And I was wondering, is there any hope that Congress will get on this? Because something like 70 to 80% of the people in the country support a woman's right to choose.
That's right, and a huge percentage of them right here and now have those rights taken away. They don't have free access to those health decisions. So, yeah, there's hope, absolutely. In the last Congress, the House of Representatives passed a national federal right to abortion. If we had a couple more votes in the Senate to do away with the filibuster, we would have put that on President Biden's desk and he would have signed it. So that tells you how close we actually are. Elections matter. And in this case, the difference is literally one or two. Right now it would be one single senator who favors getting rid of the filibuster. If we could have that one seat in the Senate, we lost the House, so it's a little more complicated now. But we're very close. We're very close.
You've talked about House of Representatives who support free thought. Are there any members of the Senate or the cabinet that would align with your philosophy?
Well, I'm sure there are. But in terms of publicly, I would be hard-pressed to name them. I have a few friends in the Senate that I've had philosophical conversations with and feel fairly certain that they are fellow travelers. But most often, when I am identified in the national press as the only non-religious member of Congress, they tend to also identify Senator Kyrsten Sinema, which offends me greatly for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons is she has not been publicly open about her religious views. Now, privately, she's an atheist. Everybody who knows her knows that, or at least everybody who knew her before she became this, someone who delights in being a political enigma. But she, I firmly believe, is an atheist, has been for some time, but she has been nothing but coy about the subject. And I don't like it when she's dignified in any way on this subject because she's just been coy. Yeah.
Hey, Congressman Huffman. Thank you so much for your time with us.
Thank you, Walt.
Thank you so much for the work you're doing in Washington and for representing us there.
Appreciate you having me. Thank you. Okay. All right, next.